President Zelensky, Big Z himself, is here on the ground. And here in Washington, he's been here since Monday, flying from Argentina to attend the inauguration of the new president there. And he gave an interesting speech, I think, which demonstrates his complete lack of political skill and lack of knowledge about any of his so-called opponents. Let's put this up there on the screen. So in his speech that he gave yesterday to the National Defense College, speaking to military leaders, but in attendance were several reporters, he says, quote, "If there's anyone inspired by unresolved issues on Capitol Hill, it is just Putin and his sick clique." So let's really think and digest that. Zelensky comes to Washington. The sole people he needs to convince are Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Republicans to do what? To drop their insistence on there has to be border security funding if we're going to fund Ukraine. And his way of doing that is not, here's why it's good for you. Here's what I can do for you. Here are the questions here are the answers to the questions which you have asked me, which is, what is my plan for victory? What am I realistically going to do with the $61 billion? Instead, his plan is to call them basically accomplices of Putin. That is not going to go down well, I think, with a lot of the people who are in opposition. And just to highlight this, we've got some of the plans about what exactly he wants to do. Let's put this up there on the screen. His plan right now, Krystal, from Axios and others, is to basically try and emotionally blackmail the House of Representatives and the Senate Republicans as the clock ticks, because the House is set. The House and the Senate are both set to leave at some time at the end of this week. Thursday is done for the entire year. Already, people on Capitol Hill and others say that there's no way. So he's coming here effectively in a last-ditch effort. I also just saw his schedule for the day. He's not meeting with the White House first. President Biden alleged that he was inviting Zelensky to Washington for them to parlay. No. His entire bulk of his day, Krystal, is spent on Capitol Hill, starting actually only 15 minutes from right now, where he'll be meeting with Speaker Johnson and then with Senate Republicans. And I think the biggest mistake that he seems to have internalized is he genuinely seems to believe that Mitch McConnell is speaking for Republicans, because Mitch McConnell is very supportive of Ukraine aid. He tried to get the party to, not insist on border security funding, to pass the standalone supplemental. And there was a full-blown revolt inside of the GOP caucus. And we played even here on the show, even freaking Lindsey Graham says, look, guys, we got to have some sort of border security funding. There's no way. He does not seem to actually understand the American political system currently at all. I actually think him coming here is a tremendous show of weakness, because how does it make you look if you come all the way to Washington with hat in hand and they basically just leave town and go home for a Christmas break after that you have done so? I think this is the final breaking point for Zelensky. I'm not saying he'll never get aid. I would never put it past the establishment. For the rest of the year, I think he's dead. I don't think he has a chance in hell.
I mean, to be honest with you, ever since we really had it confirmed that it was the U.S. and the UK that blocked that early peace deal and forced them to continue fighting. And again, listen, there's no guarantees of whether it would have come together, et cetera, et cetera. But I have a lot more empathy for Zelensky's position, because we did hang him out to dry. You know, we did lead him along the garden path and effectively say, we've got your back, and, say no to the peace deal, keep fighting. We're going to be with you, brother. And then here he is, desperate, low on manpower, low on supplies, and very unlikely to be able to come back home with anything to say for it. So, in a sense, I like I said, I have a lot more empathy for their position than I did previously, really understanding the way that all of these things unfolded. I think it's disgraceful what we've dragged the Ukrainians through. I think the amount of death and, destruction that has been wrought over these past this past year, since the beginning of this conflict, is really, there's a lot of blood on our hands for the way that we pushed them to pursue this war. So that's kind of how I'm looking at things.
I will parse a little bit. I don't have any empathy for Zelensky. I think he's basically been a blackmail artist from day one. I have incredible empathy for the Ukrainian fighting man and for all of those who laid their lives because they took Zelensky's orders. And we'll get to this a little bit later in the show, but even they are like, hey man, you got to start telling us the truth. All this rose-tinted speeches and all that ain't gonna cut it for us anymore. We got average age of 43. Just to give people an idea too, view of what the dynamics are on Capitol Hill. Here's Senator J.D. Vance. He spoke a little bit about this yesterday on Zelensky. He's the leading opponent of Ukraine aid in the Senate. Here's what he had to say.
Look, Steve, it's gross. You have a foreign leader coming to the United States like we're some sort of geopolitical Salvation Army. That is not the role of the United States here, is to hand out money to every beggar who comes into our country and demands that we fund their foreign conflict. This is, step back a second, Steve. We have to understand that Republicans, for once in this town, have actually stood pretty firm the last couple of weeks on the question of border security and said, you're not going to get another dime for Ukraine unless you do something serious about the American southern border. So Zelensky is parachuting into this domestic political debate about prioritizing our own border. He's not here to tell us anything we haven't heard before. He's here to badger and browbeat Speaker Johnson and Senate Republicans into foregoing our negotiations on border security in order to write him another blank check. I've never seen anything like this. This is not Churchill coming in the midst of World War II. This is literally a guy begging for a handout and telling Republicans to stop negotiating over your own border security. I'm offended by it. As a United States Senator, I'm offended by it. We should be focused on our own border and be having that debate. We don't need Zelensky to parachute and tell us how to run our country.
As I understand it, a lot of Republicans are not actually taking kindly to that. Senator Rand Paul said he wouldn't even attend the Zelensky meeting. He's like, I don't have anything to say to him. I have nothing that I want to hear from him. I think it's a big, big mistake that he's making. And just to,
I'm just not sure what else he's supposed to do.
Well, honestly, what Zelensky is supposed to do is he needs to realize the political reality, and he needs to make sure that he's not seen as basically aligning himself completely with the Democratic Party. What he should have done is stayed at home and allowed Mitch McConnell, the establishment, and others to try and to slip Ukraine aid at every turn for the next year, which they are going to do that. This debate is not done. They are going to, every rider, every government funding bill, there's going to be some last-ditch effort to try and to slip something in there. He should have had the knowledge that this was dead. JD actually raised Churchill, which is a good example. Churchill privately loathed the U.S. Senate. I believe he once said that you can always count on the American Senate to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. He was furious about Lend-Lease, but he was incredibly grateful every time he came to Washington. He always met with people behind the scenes. He understood the American political system, maybe because he spent a lot more time here, and he himself was half U.S., or he was born to an American. I think Zelensky just has zero understanding of the political system. He seems to believe that MSNBC and The Atlantic speak for America, and that, you know, all these neocons or whatever who will go over there.
I don't agree with that. To me, it's very clear from the fact that he is showing up here now that he realizes how weak a position he's in and how much potential additional Ukrainian aid is on the rocks. And the only thing he can think to do is, rather than just like staying in Ukraine and hoping for the best, hoping Mitch comes through, is to come here and try to reassert Ukrainian, preeminence in terms of American foreign policy.
Maybe you're right.
Because obviously the American foreign policy landscape has completely shifted since October 7th. The Ukrainians are completely on the back burner. And so to me, I don't know that he has a better hand to play. I think the best thing he probably can do is to come here and meet with the people who are sympathetic to him and just remind them, like, hey, you guys were supposed to be backing us up. And remember, we still have this righteous cause fighting back against Russian imperialism and, this territorial land grab. So try to keep us front and center. I don't know that he has a better move that he could really play.
Maybe you're right. I just think that it puts him in a weaker position to come here to advocate for it and to fail. Whereas I think he probably could have gotten something over the next year if he'd bided his time. Both are terrible options.
I mean, they're desperate.
They should be. They're in many ways this too, where you can't put all the blame here on America. A lot of this is their fault too. They seem to believe and have ridiculous expectations and have never decided to even change any of their public positioning, which, as we hinted at, let's put this up there on the screen, from the Financial Times, even people inside of Ukraine, quote, former and current advisors saying that the lack of realism in the president's messaging is undermining confidence, and that basically a lot of the Ukrainian people do not not want to hear that everything is moving forward and that everything is rosy and that everything is going to be great and that they're going to achieve a total victory. And while they may want that to happen, they also are friends with enough people who have either been killed or who know people who have been wounded or know people who are now getting drafted to understand at a basic level that is just not the military reality on the ground. I increasingly believe, and I said it here, I don't think that Zelensky's political leadership will last for all that much longer, simply because he's in open war with his own military commander. His political opponents, Poroshenko and the mayor of Kyiv, are outwardly coming and blasting him. The military commander himself is going on the record to The Economist saying it's a stalemate and there's basically nothing else that we can do. So much of the ground that he was fighting from like the united country that's moving forward, and even most of his legitimacy was under the idea that he was the only one who could convince the West to give him aid. A lot of that is just not materializing now. So,
yeah,
you know, a lot of his like raison d'etre, I guess, if you will, just doesn't exist, especially if this aid bill goes down.
Yeah, I mean, they give this example that's kind of devastating in this piece about the rose-colored glasses and how all of the videos that he puts out are about how they're moving forward and they're winning and they're gaining ground, et cetera, when people aren't stupid. And this is also like not the 1980s. You can't just control all of the information that's coming in. It's also a country that's small enough that, yeah, people are getting direct reports of what's actually going on in the front lines. But this example they cite was Ukraine's frequent use of, quote, counter-propaganda during the 10-month battle for Bakhmut. This mirrored Russian tactics in trying to maintain an image of success. Official channels on Telegram and other social media branded the fight with slogans such as Fortress Bakhmut and Unbreakable Bakhmut, which disappeared in the days before Russia declared victory in May. Zelensky never officially acknowledged Ukraine's retreat from Bakhmut, and in June, the Defense Ministry presented continued Ukrainian attacks from the edge of the town as evidence that it had not, in fact, lost the battle. So it's becoming I think has become impossible to maintain this happy face of we're making gains, we're gaining ground, everything's going on in our direction, we're on the brink of victory any day now. And, you know, when things are so sort of desperate for the Ukrainians in terms of manpower, in terms of, you know, the failures of the counteroffensive, in terms of being able to garner additional aid from us and other places around the world, yeah, you have now this specter of people turning on each other, casting blame, going to the press, you know, criticizing Zelensky in a way that we've never seen before. So certainly there is no doubt there is a lot of turmoil domestically in Ukraine.
I think you're absolutely right. And I do think that is really going to be a problem for him in the next months to come. And don't forget, the winter, you know, it's getting cold and things are only getting worse. The Russians are actually firing, I think, cruise missiles and some of those for the very first time in a long time, and largely because they're trying to degrade as much of the infrastructure as possible and make it as painful on the civilian population before they get to the next fighting season. That's before there's even questions of U.S. aid. So I think there's a lot to be said here.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.